Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us for this third event in our event series. This one is called Bridging the Trust Gap, how founders, investors, and corporates can work together to change the world. And we have like an amazing panel. So I'm looking forward to that. I'll be moderating today. But before we get to that, I just wanted to say a few words about what Founder Tribes is. It's the kind of company, the startup of which I am the CEO and founder. And so with that, I'd like to kind of just jump into a very brief presentation. So next slide, I guess. Yeah. So about me, I'm an exited serial entrepreneur, worked in the UK for a company called Telefonica, helping them to invest in early stage companies. And I've also taught more recently at Yale Law School teaching entrepreneurship. And I launched Founder Tribes in part because of one of the speakers that we're going to see today. So next slide. So actually, the speaker that I'm talking about is Elizabeth Nyeko. She was one of the founders that we had invested in at Wyra. And I was always perplexed by the fact that here is a woman who had a PhD from Oxford. She's ex-Goldman Sachs. She started a renewable energy startup, so kind of a hot space. There's no kind of argument about it's being, good space to invest in these days. But still, she wasn't getting the funding that I thought that she deserved. And when I asked her more recently at an event at Bloomberg, what did she think was going on? She said that she thought it was because of the credibility gap. This notion that, investors tended to see her as risk or maybe charity, but they couldn't really see her as a credible, future category winner, a la Mark Zuckerberg or Elon Musk. Next slide. And the reality is that if people can't see you, they can't invest in you. And there are a lot of groups that aren't really being seen. So this includes female-led companies, which only get about 2.4% of venture capital funding, Blacks and Latinos, who only get about 2.6% of US venture capital funding, people who don't live in the right cities. So a lot of the venture capital funding, for example, in the UK, 88% of it goes only to London, or in the US, about 85% of it goes to California, New York, and Massachusetts. So if you don't live in one of those states or in one of those cities, the likelihood that you're going to get funding goes down dramatically. And also, if you didn't go to the quote unquote right school, it's also really unlikely that you're going to get funding, because a lot of times the people who make those decisions went to those schools, and they tend to favor people who remind them of themselves. Next slide. So when we kind of multiply this globally, what we're seeing is that there are hundreds of millions of founders who might be failing unnecessarily. The accepted failure rate is that 90% of companies are going to fail. And I'm not really sure why that's accepted, because it seems kind of outrageous. And it suggests that this is a huge market inefficiency. So in the US alone, if we say that 4.4 million businesses were created in 2020, that means that 4 million of those companies will eventually fail, or 470 million of the 582 businesses globally. Next slide. And as we all know, minorities and women, we're becoming the majority. So in the US, women, well, I guess by definition are about 51% of the population, but minorities will become the majority in about 25 years. And if we were allowed to participate equally in the economy, in the US economy, we would add about $4.4 trillion to the US annual GDP. And this is why we're seeing lots of corporates suddenly waking up to the fact that we have to do something about this, not only because it's the right thing to do, but also because it's a really lucrative thing to do. If this is the majority of your population in the US, and somehow or another they don't trust you, they don't see you as a legitimate partner, then that's going to affect your bottom line eventually. Next slide. And it's not just the bottom line. What we're also seeing, this is a great article that was in the New York Times about 2 weeks ago, that we're seeing that this need to be seen, respected, and appreciated, what the columnist David Brooks called thymotic desires. His argument is that this is what's actually fueling stuff like, Putin's war against Ukraine, or Brexit, or people who vote for Trump. Not that I'm going to make any sort of political statement here, but the idea is that there are lots of people that, feel this way, and it's not even kind of limited by geographic boundaries. There's a basic human need to kind of feel seen, respected, and appreciated. Next slide. So our vision is to help finders find the funders and the mentors that see them and therefore are able and willing to invest in and mentor them. Next slide. The founder journey is relatively simple. Through an app, like, we're not trying to reinvent the wheel. We think of ourselves more of as like Amazon to, let's say, Macy's or John Lewis. The basic practice exists offline, but the question is, why wouldn't we put it online? If putting it online just makes it a lot more efficient and allows for us to scale it to a lot more people. So the idea is that founders upload a pitch, they get feedback on a 1 to 5 star basis on the 10 areas of business plan that most founders need to have compelling answers to. as defined by Sequoia Capital. If it turns out that the founders are already fundable, then we help them to find the investors or funders that might be relevant for them based on their stage, their industry, as well as affinity. And if they're not quite fundable, then we match them to educational resources and potential mentors in their areas of weakness. Next slide. And I think the big difference between us and a lot of the other companies that exist is that we're not afraid to lean into something that's called homophily, which is a sociological tendency for people to bond with people that are similar to them. Some people call this like birds of a feather flocking together. Research shows that if you went to the same university as someone, or if you belong to the same race as them, you're a lot more likely to want to actually work with them. And what we're saying is for groups that have been historically locked out, that might be the only way to get into economic and social systems. So, for example, if someone reaches out to me, the fact that I'm Black or that I belong to the LGBT community or that I'm an immigrant, those are reasons that I might be able to see them and help them in ways that maybe others wouldn't. And that could be a way to kind of really unlocking someone's potential. Next slide. And the goal eventually is to kind of redefine the way that we network professionally, so that, LinkedIn was great when it was created back in 2002, but it's been 20 years already. And we think that matchmaking should look more like it does when people are thinking about dating, for example. And it should also be built in a way that inclusivity exists at its core. Next slide. So now I'd like to show you a little video that we put together that kind of shows our vision in a kind of more creative way, and I hope that you'll like it. So I'll ask Petar now to put that video on. We live in a world where 99.9% of the world's 600 million entrepreneurs are treated like roadkill. They might not be from the right race, or they might not be from the right gender, or maybe they don't live in the right postcode, or might not have attended the right school. And because they don't sound or look the part, they will never get access to the feedback, networks, and capital they need to start up and scale up their businesses. Talent is distributed evenly, but opportunity is not. Founder tribes exist to change that. Our mobile app uses machine learning to match founders with the investors, mentors, and educational support that they need. We're like Tinder, but for founders. It all begins with the founders submitting a pitch that will be evaluated by a community of entrepreneurs and investors relevant to their vertical and stage. Each founder gets qualified feedback about the weakest areas of their business plan, as articulated in their pitch. They are evaluated according to the 10 elements of a business plan as per Sequoia Capital's evaluation system. There are two possible outcomes. If a founder is deemed investable, they will automatically be matched with investors appropriate for their stage and vertical. A founder can also choose to see investors who have made the hire or sent the wire in the past, meaning investors with a track record of investing in or hiring people of backgrounds similar to the founders. If a founder is not deemed investable, they will be offered a personalized selection of video tips from world-class founders relating to their areas of weakness. They will also be matched with expert mentors to work through their risk factors. When the founder is finally deemed investable by their mentor and the community, they will then be introduced to the relevant investors for them with an optimized chance of success. Our database includes 18,000 angels, 3,000 venture capitalists, and 5,000 mentors. Our world-class content comes from such gurus as Stacey Abrams, Steve Blank, Jen Wang, and Anne Wojcicki. We have distribution deals on 4 continents, including with the City of New York, London and Partners, Silicon Valley Bank, Capital Enterprise, and Unicaf. We have also raised $1.2 million from British investors such as Velocity Capital Advisors and Chris Topman, and American unicorn founders such as Sander Daniels, the founder of Thumbtack, which has raised $436 million from Sequoia Capital and Google, Zach Bookman, the founder of OpenGov, who has raised $140 million from investors including Andreessen Horowitz, and Dana Wagner, Chief Legal Officer at Impossible Foods, which has raised $1.5 billion from investors including Serena Williams, Katy Perry, and Jay-Z. If software is eating the world, it's time for the startup ecosystem itself to be disrupted. It's no longer acceptable to relegate and ignore 99.9% of founders. Founder Tribes uses machine learning to empower millions of entrepreneurs around the world, regardless of what they look like or where they come from. We hope that you will join us. Please download the app today. All right, awesome. So as the video said, our ask for you, listeners, dear listeners, is to download the app, send us your feedback so that we can continuously improve, and to recommend it to any entrepreneurs, or for that matter, investors or mentors who you think might find what we're doing relevant to their personal missions or to what they're trying to do. And with that, next slide, I'd like to introduce our panel. But before I do that, actually, I'd like to introduce one of the people that we mentioned or referenced in the video, Vanessa from Silicon Valley Bank. Vanessa is one of our key sponsors. The first sponsor actually that we got, she kind of reached out to me on LinkedIn and said, how can I help? And I was like, send us some money and also kind of show us some support. And without kind of batting an eyelid, that's exactly what they did. So Silicon Valley Bank definitely rocks. And I'd like to turn it over now to Vanessa to kind of say a bit more about what they do.
Yeah, of course. And thank you so much. We're really excited at SVB to be supporting the work that Founder Tribes is doing. And so my team, the new and strategic channels group at SVB, is really proud to support Founder Tribes. And we are passionate about building community and driving change within the innovation ecosystem. And so we do that through a number of ways, but mainly our free banking for founders. So no minimum deposit required, no monthly transaction fees, free domestic and international wires, as well as a ton of great resources. And we really look forward to connecting with this vibrant ecosystem of founders, investors, and ecosystem builders post this event. So I'll share a link in the chat on how to connect with our team. Thank you.
Awesome. And I can't recommend them highly enough, just like I can't recommend highly enough Petar, our wonderful producer who's been doing all these events for us for a year, just because he believes in the cause so much. So thank you, Petar. Also, the last couple of things I want to say before I go to the panel is we're doing another event next week, which is all about helping founders to kind of really think through how to build a company from scratch. So Watch a Space will send you an email with the kind of ability to register there. And then lastly, we're trying to do an event on the 16th and 17th of June based at Howard Law School, which we're calling our HBCU or Historically Black Colleges and University Boot Camp. Vanessa's already agreed to speak. So thank you, Vanessa, for agreeing to speak there. We're trying to figure out if we can do a Baychella type after party. So maybe that will happen as well. But even if that doesn't happen, it'll be a really cool event. So without much further ado, I'd like now to bring to the fore our kind of amazing panel. It's really crazy that we were able to bring such a panel together, starting with Steve Armstrong, who is the transformation officer at Ford Motor Company. As he mentioned to us, I think you said you've been working at Ford for about 40 years or something like that. So that's awesome. I'd like also to bring to the panel Elizabeth Nyeko, who is, I was mistakenly calling her Liz, but now I've been corrected, it's Elizabeth. And she's the CEO and founder of Modularity Grid, as well as a graduate of Oxford, where she got her PhD, but she'll explain a little bit more about her history in a little bit. We also have Donovan Hamlet, who is currently a strategy and operations lead manager at LinkedIn, but that's his day job, his passion, I guess, and he maybe will be able to explain this to us as well, is building an EV or electronic vehicle company, trucking company, and bringing that to the US. And then finally, we have Kyan Conti, who is a serial entrepreneur. He has 2 companies, I understand, that have kind of become unicorns, where he's been a founder of both of them. And now he is a founding partner and a limited partner at Ozone X Ventures, which supports and invests in underrepresented founders. So thank you, panel, for joining us. And I think what I wanted to do first and foremost was to ask each of you to introduce yourselves, maybe in the form of a 1-minute pitch. Elizabeth, I'm going to say ladies first. So I'm going to start with you.
Great, thanks. Hi, everyone. My name is Elizabeth. I'm founder of a company called Modularity Grid. We are we're on this mission to accelerate the deployment of microgrids. So microgrids are small scale, standalone power generation and distribution systems. So you could actually describe something like an EV charging station as a microgrid, or it could be a system that's supplying electricity to a group of homes or to a building. Yeah, so my background, I studied at Oxford. I worked initially at the beginning of my career in finance. I was in an investment banking role at a couple of bulge bracket banks. And then from there, went back to university. The first company I set up was actually focusing on setting up, essentially doing what a property developer would do, but for renewable energy. So setting up renewable energy infrastructure. So we developed a 20 megawatt grid project that uses biomass and then off-grid microgrid infrastructure. And yeah, so that's me. Looking forward to the conversation today.
Awesome. All right, so let's go next to who do I have next? Steve. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks, Gary. Hello, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here. So I'm Steve Armstrong, and as Gary mentioned, I've worked within the auto industry for 40 years, and I've spent 35 of those years working within Ford Motor Company, for the various companies that Ford has owned through the years. I've had the pleasure of living on 4 continents and working in 6 different countries. So I've seen a lot of the world and a lot of different experiences as I've made my way through Ford Motor Company. So I'm a group vice president at Ford. I'm currently responsible for the redevelopment of our business in India and in South America, 2 kind of different time zones, but I'm able to manage that from my home here in the UK. Personally, I left school at 16 and I did an apprenticeship. So I kind of worked my way up from the bottom, as it were. I too went back to university went to university when I was 32 years old. I became a director at Jaguar when Ford was owning it when I was 32. And I felt that it was probably the right thing to do to go get the qualifications that I then expected all of my kind of graduate students to have. So I studied while I was working. And then I actually met Gary at the University of East London recently, where I got an honorary doctorate, and I'm a governor on the board of the university. So doing my bit to give back to education, which has served me well over the years. So looking forward to the conversation and to putting forward a little bit the corporate view in this evening's chat. So thank you for the invitation, Gary.
No, perfect. Thank you for coming. All right, so next let's hear from Donovan.
Awesome. Hello, everyone. Donovan Hamlet. I am a full-time employee at LinkedIn working in strategy in their marketing business. But as Gary alluded to, I work on a startup called Drive with the focus of bringing commercial vehicles in the heavy-duty space to the U.S. market. It's been something I've been working on for several years. I have like this entrepreneurial background of my first startup idea was bringing airline to the U.S. market, which we can talk about later on. But, looking for as a big game hunter, trying to find those big things that most people won't touch to really make an impact in the world we live in. So happy to be here and happy to discuss more and learn more about it.
Perfect. And last but not least, perfect. Thank you. Last but not least, Kyan.
So I'm here for you all, hopefully. The hope is to make your path a little bit easier. So I've been a founder many times, 8 times in total. I've been fortunate to have 2 recent unicorns, Lime and a company called Charge, both in the electrification mobility space. But really my larger goal is to help founders really bring their full potential to the businesses they believe they can bring to the globe and hopefully impact it with its best possible overall outcome. OzoneX, the fund where I'm currently a partner and an investor that's leading the charge towards, as Gary said it, doing the right thing and getting, proving that we can drive returns as good as anyone else. So we invest in underserved founders that are working on bold missions. And again, hopefully that's you, and hopefully I'm here to help.
Perfect. All right, so let's start the questioning round now with Elizabeth. As I alluded to in the video, you were kind of in some ways the inspiration for the company. Like you have on paper everything that one could possibly have, right, to be successful. But I guess you've had, not the easiest funding journey. So I was wondering if you'd be able to share a little bit about kind of your experience as a Black female founder in a kind of very non-traditional space, at least for Black female founders. And also, what did you mean when you talked about the credibility gap? Help us to unpack that.
Yeah, thanks, Gary. Wow, two big questions, all mashed up. So I would say personally, it has been particularly challenging to raise funding because, well, I mean, I can't say for definitely why, but my view is that it might be because to a certain extent, a lot of the times when I try and engage with investors, they do sort of almost otherize me, and so it's almost like the conversations and I see the interactions that they would have with other founders, even in the same room, within, let's say, seconds apart, tend to be so different from the interactions that they have with me. So the questions that go towards the other founders are almost about like, okay, so tell me about your business. And then it's kind of a very sort of positive conversation, talking about metrics, talking about achievements, results. And the conversations with me very quickly kind of go to, oh, okay. Oh, what made you work on that? And then, oh, where are you from? And then very quickly from there, it sort of goes towards sort of trying to kind of prod holes and trying to kind of establish whether I actually know what I'm talking about. And so it's quite sort of different in that sense. So that's kind of one side of it. And typically, I suppose, coming to this sort of scenario, the expectation, if you just look at the kind of typical setup, unsurprisingly, investors will be looking for kind of pattern matching, because that's kind of a safe way of picking up certain traits or things like that would mean that an investment might be more likely to succeed based on kind of past experience. But I suppose kind of the way that process is done probably shouldn't include none kind of traits that are irrelevant, right? So the way I so what I look like shouldn't factor into that equation, but unfortunately that is something that does have to happen. So for example, what I've learned the hard way is that when I go into these conversations, I have to start by listing my credentials up front, to almost kind of say, hey, I have a right to talk to you, or like, give me a few minutes of your time, sort of thing. And then if I don't do that, I find that like they spend the whole conversation either really kind of just wondering who I am and why I'm there, that they don't even hear what I'm trying to say. So I would say that is kind of what I refer to as the credibility gap, because you walk into the room and the assumption is that you don't know anything and that you shouldn't be there, and you have to kind of earn your right to be there. And so that means that in the end you lose time, or you waste you don't have as much time to focus on talking about your business, talking about your achievements, talking about your results. And yeah, so that's my take on it anyway.
So I'm going to bring in Donovan here really quickly, because Donovan, I remember that when we first spoke, I kind of asked you, I was like, well, it's kind of weird seeing a Black guy in trucking, electronic trucking, you know what I mean? And I was like, how do other people respond to you in that regard, and do they take you seriously? And I wanted to kind of basically get a sense as to, you and Liz are kind of living on different continents. She's in Europe, you're in America, you're male, she's female, but I got the sense that kind of you could relate to her story. So maybe tell us a little bit about like what your experience has been trying to do this thing that's this kind of huge project in an area that hasn't traditionally been identified with minority entrepreneurs.
Yeah, I completely relate to the credibility gap on so many fronts. But, I think even going back to talking about doing an airline, right? I think, you can argue that these large industrial or manufacturing or really, really intense businesses require some level of expertise of being in the field, and being that I didn't have any experience in it, I'm automatically discounted, right? Like, what do you actually know? You don't sit in the field. You don't have any idea what it's like. And it's pretty unfair, to be completely frank. There's a valid argument with some of the reps you require to build an expertise on things, but it doesn't require you to have an idea that could potentially make sense, right? And so I think it's been a challenge. I think as the airlines got to me as the one thing that makes the most sense from what do you know? Because when you start to talk to people about it, the first thing is like, why would you want to do that? Or the airline industry doesn't make any money. It's super complicated, right? It's so intense operationally. And it's like, that's exactly why I want to do it, because you don't, right? Because you're not excited about it. I'm excited about it. And I think there's an opportunity to make a splash in this space and like be disruptive. And so when I think about the EV space, you know, my old man is a Ford person, FYI, Steve. So I used to work on like on 60-hour muscle cars. And I could pull apart like a 427, put it together. I just grew up around automotive, like the automotive space so much. And so when it came to an opportunity to like make a splash in a market that I thought was interesting, I was like, you know, I looked at the trucking space and like it's the backbone of the US economy and technically the global economy. And there's not a lot of adoption of EV trucks in the US market, right? There is that transit van space and right, like with the last mile delivery. But once you pass that, anything heavier than that is not getting a lot of attention until you get to Class A vehicles. And so my job was like, hey, how can I actually make an opportunity? This is my dog, Aries. He's also excited about it. How can I make an opportunity to like really, really make an impact here? And what can I do to make sense of it? And then as you talk to investors about it, there are like a lot of questions on what do you know? How do you feel like you're an expert in this space? You're not an electrical engineer. You're not an automotive person. You're not a mechanical engineer. And like you realize that there's enough information to be deadly out there to be actually understand the opportunity. And then I also realized that building a team is also very, very important to cancel out some of the doubt that may come across I've had in conversations.
Awesome. So I guess you were, if I understood it correctly, an immigrant and also kind of a Latin American immigrant, but you've been able to kind of create 2 unicorn companies. How has your journey been in terms of being able to get investors to believe in your capacity to actually build these billion-dollar businesses?
Sorry, I was frozen there for a second. I mean, I think in my particular case, I was blessed with 2 sides of this coin. I look white, except for the curly hair. And if I shave, you don't really think that I'm Brazilian or Latino. And so it's odd for me to be in this place where I can kind of turn on 2 different sides. And I have to play, to be frank, the white side, right? If I'm with my, overall Brazilian community, I play a very different game. We talk very differently in terms of, what matters to us. How you run business is different. I don't talk about business for a whole 55 minutes of an hour session if you're in Latin America. In the US, I got to start within the first 2 to 3 minutes on the business or else I get discredited. And so I found myself constantly shifting to be more of what is this version of that I'm supposed to be. And then as a result, you kind of end up finding that you're not authentic to what you are in your own, background, skill sets, where you're coming from. And that's really the juice. That's what makes the world unique, is the diversity of perspectives. And that's what I feel like, in my particular case, I learned how to chameleon, to be better and more like this, to sound more like this, to dress more like this. I mean, I only let my hair curl, I realized, when I was like, in second company unicorn in, and I was like, why have I been doing the whole, cut hair, looks like it's straight, acting like I'm one of the other ones, putting on a tie and stuff, when I'm like, this is not me. Like, it never has been, but I've learned to play the game. And playing the game should be more about skill, experience, talent, drive. I mean, I want hunger and passion with the ability to just have fortitude with learning cycles. But that's not really what we understand how to quantify. We understand degrees, we understand tones of skin, tones of voice. And that to me is part of where we have to recreate the biases. We're not going to get rid of biases. It's part of living. You come up with different thoughts and different things that create your world, your frame of view. It's more opening up the biases and changing what they were to new forms and frames that allow for a much more open conversation and more authentic people.
That's awesome. So I guess, Steve, like your experience, I guess, is a little bit different. You're in the UK and you're in a corporate environment. But what I really found interesting about your story is kind of like what you said, that you kind of started without going to college. Like in the UK, it seems to me like Oxford and Cambridge matter so much and all that kind of stuff. But you were able to kind of work your way up without all of these advantages or privileges. Tell us a little bit about your story. Can you relate to some of this credibility gap issue, or is it kind of all foreign?
No, I can relate to it. And, I think as with everything in life, there's an element of luck or good fortune as you progress, right? You have to be a little bit in the right place at the right time. And, there are I always say there are a lot of people that I worked with when I was younger that were much better at the job than I was, but perhaps they didn't take the opportunities that were offered to them as fully as I did. So, I learned very early on that if the boss at the time asked me to do something, it was because A, it needed doing, and B, he thought that I would be good at getting it done. So, throwing myself into the challenge and into the task and doing it to the best of my ability, has always been the way I've approached my job. And I also think that I tend to be more street smart than I am academically bright. So, I had a good education and I did well at school, but I didn't like school very much, which is why I left at 16, and I was really keen to get to work. But I figured out quite quickly that I was actually better at kind of getting stuff done than other people. And I think that being able to apply yourself is very important. I try to stay very humble. I think I do at least, and I try to be very grounded. I went back to school when I was 32 to do my degree while I was working because, I felt that I needed to experience what I was expecting everybody else to have done as we were starting to recruit more graduates. So, I needed to learn how to think like the graduates were thinking and experience what they'd been doing. So that kind of learning journey is also important. And the other critical thing for me is that I've had a very supportive family around me. As I said in my introduction, we've lived in 6 countries on 4 continents, including Brazil, actually. So I'm very familiar with the Latino way of doing business. And I spent 5 years down there. And, my family kind of gave up a lot of their own expectations to support my career. And, without that support, it would have been impossible for me to progress. And my kind of key takeaways are it's a constant learning experience. I don't know the answers to most of the questions I get asked, but I can go and figure out how to figure the answers out and stay very grounded and take the chances that are given to you. Because my experience is that sometimes the job that you are least interested in is the one that you actually learn the most from. And that's a bit of advice I often give to the graduates when I'm talking to them when they're starting their careers in Ford Motor Company.
All right, so Steve, I'm going to actually ask the next question to you first. I'm going out of order of the questions I sent, which is, so now you're around all of these entrepreneurs trying to create these unicorns, and you're at Ford. And Henry Ford, I guess, is one of the iconic entrepreneurs of the 20th century in the US, right? And I guess globally. But now he's being disrupted by maybe one of the iconic entrepreneurs of the 21st century. So based on the data that I've seen, Tesla is now valued at $1 trillion. And Ford is valued at $62 billion, even though Ford sells 4 times as many vehicles as Tesla. And I guess this is all because people think that Ford is looking towards the past, even though Ford is trying to change that. And Tesla is giving a very clear vision of the future. Do you think that's a fair assessment? And how do you think corporates should kind of work with startups or with innovation more generally so that they don't end up getting disrupted?
Well, I guess it's a fair valuation if that's what the market sees it as at the moment. And, firstly, I commend Tesla on the way they have disrupted everybody and everything. I mean, I was, like many people in my industry, one of the skeptics at the start. It'll fail. He's not going to get there. He's losing too much money. But clearly it's not going to fail. They're being very successful, and we should applaud them for that. And I think the disruption is a good thing for us. We're a 120-year-old company. We've been through many, many crises in the past, whether it's depressions, technological shifts, world wars. We've always managed to come through that. And I know that Ford Motor Company will come through this and will be a winner at the end of the day in this process, because we've got a chairman who is absolutely passionate about the environment, Bill Ford. He was, preaching in this space before many people were even thinking it was, the direction the industry would go. We've got a CEO now who is passionate about changing the business and has put a strategy in place that's going to deliver. And we've got a set of iconic vehicles that we're electrifying, whether it's the Mustang, the F-150, or the Transit that's already been referred to, which other companies don't have. So, we have that platform to start from. We were too slow to recognize the shift. And that 120 years of history is a lot of baggage to shed as well. We have to disposition a lot of assets, and we've got a lot of money tied up in areas that startups like Tesla don't have to worry about. So we're kind of managing the past as well as trying to invent our own version of the future. But I think we will be successful, and we should welcome the disruption, because that's what makes us improve and makes us better as we move forward. So, I'm actually quite excited by where Ford is. If you think about how we can combine all that absolute brilliance that we have in manufacturing things with the new technology that we're now developing moving forward, we're going to be in a great place, which is good for us.
I like the response, and I'm going to turn it over to Donovan because I sent you the same article from the New York Times, and you were like, "The lightning is hot or awesome." I can't remember the words you used, but how do you want to work with corporates to kind of get your startup to the next level? What would your vision of, like, if you could talk to a senior executive at Ford and say, okay, well, if you guys want to stay ahead of the curve, this is how you should be working with startups. Tell us a little bit about what that pitch could look like, and maybe you could pitch yourself as well.
Yeah, shameless plug. There was a Ford Lightning event in my neighborhood this weekend for the auto show, and I kept walking by it, eyeballing it, like asking questions about it. So it's a good-looking truck. Yeah, like I think it plays to things that Steve already alluded to, right? Like Ford is an old company with a lot of baggage, right? And what a startup can provide is an opportunity for them to penetrate a space or market in a way that they may not be able to do with the speed or execution that a startup could provide. And so my view on this is like, hey, you may not play in this space today. You might want to. The opportunity for you to do that is probably a long shot from your fiscal cycle of 5-year, 10-year strategy. If you let us invest in me, I can solve that problem for you. I can leverage your expertise in the manufacturing space and how to go to market strategy. But I will let us manage the opportunity to define what the vehicle should look like, be, and so forth. And we work together to penetrate the market. To me, that is like a really easy layup for both parties, right? Because both parties win. There's skin in the game for both parties, right? You want that success for each side, and then there's an opportunity for the nimbler company to actually pivot when necessary and enter new opportunities at will. And so to me, that makes sense, right? The market needs disruption, as stated, but it's easy to point at like Tesla and say, oh my God, they're doing such an incredible job and it's awesome. But it doesn't mean, if you notice, 10 years ago, Tesla was the only company with electric vehicles. And now every major manufacturer has an electric vehicle product, and some are moving away from ICE completely. And so being conscious of what that means doesn't mean that like you're late to the game, because you obviously have the scale to play in it, but now you have to think about creative ways to enter the game so that you can actually be successful in the long term.
And I'm actually gonna, I was watching for some reason, well, I know why I was watching it, the French presidential debate, because I kind of want to make sure the pen doesn't win. But she was making this argument about electric cars, and she was saying, oh, but these electric cars are basically classist, right? Because the average person is worrying about kind of fuel costs, and you're trying to tell us that we need to buy these overly expensive electric vehicles. So how do we kind of make sure that as we're doing all of these changes and this disruption, et cetera, we're doing it in a way that's also equitable? So maybe I'm gonna throw it out to, I'll throw it out to Steve, and then I'll go to Donovan, and then to Liz and Elizabeth, and then to Cayenne.
Yeah, I mean, the challenge is the technology at the outset is expensive, and the batteries cost a lot of money, and so it will start at the higher end. Even if you think about Tesla, they started with the Model S, which is the most expensive vehicle in their range, and now it's trickling down as the technology rapidly gets cheaper, and the cost of the batteries will come down, and the energy density will improve. So that trickle down effect will happen. Ultimately, we will have to provide vehicles for the whole of the market. We can't all play in the upper segments, and we will figure out how to make the tech accessible to all of the segments and sectors that we play in. Reality is, though, that we've been providing very low cost vehicles with no profits for quite some period of time. And those of us that work in the industry know that we don't make money on the small cars, but we sell them because you need the volume and the scale. So the dynamics of the business will have to change, and there will be a different business model as we move forward. And maybe access to vehicles will be different. Maybe subscription models, micro mobility, and different ways of people accessing mobility will come out of the technology shift. And we've already seen that in some different mobility models that are in places around the world. So I think the disruption will be not just in the propulsion system, but it will be in the way people access mobility as we move forward as well. So it's kind of a little bit narrow-minded to just think about it as the vehicles are expensive. If you turn the question around a little bit and say, how can people get access to what they need from mobility, and does electrification make that simpler in future? That's probably a more interesting question and a different way to look at the problem, I think.
And Steve, I'm just going to follow up with you really quickly. Since you're working in I think you said India and Latin America, right? Are you finding that people are like, this environmental stuff is for the developing countries, that we're the ones that created the problem? Why should we all of a sudden be concerned as we are trying to also grow, quickly?
I don't think people think, well, my experience at least, people don't think of it as, well, we don't have to do this because it's somebody else's problem. I think if you drive a good EV, it's a nicer experience than driving a good internal combustion engine in many, many ways. I mean, it's a great thing to experience. And I think those people are still getting access to vehicles in some of the regions of the world. If they can skip straight to EVs, that'd be a much better outcome for them as consumers, hopefully for the environment, and for the industry in general. Just the same as in the telecoms industry, many places in Africa missed out landlines completely and went straight to mobile. That's got to be a better solution for everybody ultimately. So I think I don't see pushback in places like India and South America. I do see infrastructure issues. Putting the infrastructure in is actually more difficult than making the product. And in some of those places, and Ken will know that, getting electricity into some places in Brazil or Colombia or Peru, it's not quite the same as plugging your car in the center of London. So there are some
You don't even talk about imports and export duties and everything else that makes it more of a pain yet.
Absolutely. So, but I think she's looking at it from the wrong lens a little bit if she thinks it's an elitist play, in my opinion.
So actually, I'm going to go to Cayenne next, because when I just start to think about like Lime and mopeds and stuff like that, how do you see this playing out in terms of making sure that when we kind of do have this kind of green revolution, it's kind of equitable and it's not kind of only on benefiting some certain people?
Yeah, no, I mean, there's obviously lots of ways to look at the problem, and therefore we need a number of, let's say, unified solutions to really address it. And I think, first off, when you think EV, I think we wrongly think cars, right, and car replacement. Really, there's a whole range of what an electric vehicle is, from small to truck, right, or even obviously we can think of planes, right. And the reality is diversifying that perspective and really think about what's the right mode of transportation for the job, and how do we really begin to be more conservationist in choosing the right vehicle that theoretically is the most sustainable and gets you from point A to point B with the least amount of footprint. And I think that then opens up a whole lot of other conversation as well. Then it's a question of availability. That's when you have transportation deserts and other things like that, where if they can't possibly get to an electric bus to make the electric decision, or if they can't ultimately have a charging station in their neighborhood because it's not yet profitable because there's not enough EVs there, and therefore companies not going to put it on their roadmap of an important market to make sure they create infrastructure for that. All of that continues to further create a lack of equity. And I think in particular the aspect of infrastructure is one where I look at Lime, and what I've sort of seen in the micromobility industry is that whenever I first went to cities offering this sort of concept of, look, we want to be a city partner, we have this ability to cut down what is 80% of your rides that are under a mile and really make them more efficient, their first reaction is, oh, we can't do that, we don't have safe streets, the infrastructure is not there. And the reality is chicken and egg. They're not going to invest in infrastructure until they see the ridership and the need, but there's not going to be the ridership and need until there's infrastructure. And so it ends up being this sort of stalemate of innovation. And unfortunately, those who hurt the most are those who most need it, right? Those who are in the transportation deserts, who don't have access to, being a great market returner and therefore not the right place to launch your vehicle, right? And that to me is a huge part of where the inequity continues, is we're almost creating these little pockets that are, let's say, enabled, while meanwhile right next to it, this pocket couldn't possibly imagining benefiting from this type of technology. And so I think it only stays elitist as long as we continue to allow for the infrastructure, for what are the subsidies, things that really allow for this to be a choice for every household.
And Elizabeth, how do you see it? Because I know this infrastructure question is like the heart of your business. So how do you?
I laid you up, Elizabeth. I laid you up. Go for it.
Yeah. How do you see all this? Thank you, Ken.
Thanks, Ken, and thanks, Steve. Yeah, great background. So I absolutely, don't agree that electric vehicles and or this push for electrification of vehicles, of kind of renewable energy infrastructure is elitist. So we actually, maybe I can just start off with, we just completed an Innovate UK, so basically government institution that funds startups to do technically challenging projects. And we just completed a project in a village that has never had access to electricity before. Essentially giving us a chance to show how our software made it possible for to bring down the sort of operating cost component of microgrids to make it more affordable so that electricity tariffs can go down. And a key part of that microgrid that we set up as the demonstrator was enabling electric vehicle charging. And now I'm not talking Teslas or, fancy Fords, but sort of really simple 2- and 3-wheeled vehicles that we actually just hacked, like custom made. So one we made was actually, so both of them were just running on petrol engines. We removed that, added an electric motor and a battery, and voila, electric vehicle. Obviously the range is only about 50 kilometers or so, but one of them is an ambulance right now, and it's completely transformed access to emergency healthcare in that village, where actually the infrastructure for kind of fueling stations for diesel isn't there. So if someone needed to go to hospital for an emergency, one person would have to cycle to the nearest fueling station, but and come and cycle back with the jerry can full of fuel to kind of so you just to fill a motorcycle. So that's a key thing that we were able to overcome with this project. The second vehicle was just a 2-wheeled motorcycle. Again, the same way we converted. And what we found is that it just makes a tremendous difference, because suddenly people who are in this farming community are able to transport their goods a little bit further to a higher value market rather than being price takers and selling everything at farm gate. And so the impact of electrification can really be huge, because and whether it's just and it's so broad, so whether it's across kind of health, education, and for me personally, as someone who was born in a village that only got electricity when I set up a company to set up electricity for the very, very first time, I grew up kind of having to make sure that I do my homework at lunchtime at school, because it would get dark in the evening and I wouldn't be able to finish my homework because there would be no light. Sometimes there's a candle at home, sometimes there isn't, because those things were expensive as well. And so for me, to access to energy, access to affordable, reliable electricity is something that it's personal. It's absolutely personal. And so, which is why I've kind of set up my company. But kind of going back to the point about electric vehicles, I think there is, there's one way to look at it and say, okay, there's the kind of the people who are kind of low income countries off grid, and then there's the kind of high income countries with a grid. Actually, there's problems on both sides. On the one hand, you've got obviously, the need to actually create electric infrastructure. But even if you're talking about the UK, just lots of electric vehicles popping up everywhere, EV charging stations popping up everywhere is actually a serious risk to the grid, to grid stability. And so, and this is an old grid, 100 plus years old. It's only going to get older, and there's going to be this huge need, to the order of trillions of investment needed to actually kind of upgrade it to the standards of it, that people would expect. And so I think, and that kind of brings me back to what we're doing, there's going to be this need for microgrids to be set up, and for and I'm talking about kind of standalone off-grid microgrids. And I think EV charging infrastructure in particular will need to kind of make that transition to having kind of independent battery storage, kind of separate from the grid, in order to be able to overcome that challenge of that kind of risk to grid infrastructure going forward.
Awesome. That was like a really great response, especially the personal story. That's going to stay with me. So let's go to Donovan, because I want to ask you, you said that your goal is to bring EV trucks to America. And I know from the backstory that you're saying that most of them are produced in China. Why doesn't America have them? I mean, like, why can't we produce them ourselves? Tell us a little bit about kind of where the need for your product comes from.
Yeah, I think that a lot of the drive for EV adoption in the commercial space is government regulated, right? And so a lot of the push is that there's requirements that you have to hit in a period of time. And so roughly 20 years ago plus, China had a massive regulation that every bus in every major city needed to be electric, right? And so now there are over 10,000 electric buses driving around in China, where I think the stat is still roughly under 500 in the US market. And And so from an adoption perspective, China was leading the way. When you think about heavy duty truck adoption over the last year or two, EMEA has been very, very intentionally focused on actually increasing adoption. And so in the US market, for a lot of reasons, some of it political, some of it of the unknown was talked about, and I'll touch on in just a second, there hasn't been a lot of push to move towards EV adoption in the heavy duty trucking space that hasn't been fostered by the private sector, right? And so the FedExes, the DHLs, the Amazons are like, hey, we know the hit to our bottom line would improve if we could actually have electric vehicles running in the space. But when you think about, there are roughly 15 million trucks in the US that fall into the single class type, so not like massive semi trucks. They tend to be owned by a company that has a fleet size of 10 or less. And so there's just an education of the three major things that I'll say is the three things that most manufacturers, or I should say companies, have an issue with is one, they don't truly understand where to purchase a vehicle and they don't have a type to solve for their current needs. Two, the infrastructure needs, as we've talked about. And three, the utilization profile, right? And I think that's the hardest part in the commercial space, where you could just fill up after you ride 300 miles. Obviously, there's not a lot of infrastructure to support that. And so you have to change your perspective on how you utilize your fleet of vehicles, similar to how airlines do it, right? You have a small plane flying small routes. You have a big plane flying longer distances. Think about your fleets being dedicated to that type of utilization profile. And so that's one of the areas that I realized that, like, hey, besides California and New York, if you anywhere else in the country, there isn't a lot of attention being paid to like the EV trucking space if it isn't supported by like the Walmarts, the FedExes, and so forth. And so that's changing, right? California is really being aggressive on moving towards the EV or electrification of all combustion engine vehicles, or in generally, I think in 2023 or 2024, no single stroke or two stroke engines are allowed to be sold anymore in California. And then that they're ramping up against automotive sales and commercial truck sales in the next 20 years. And so the market exists. There's such a wide glaring opportunity, to be completely frank, right? And it's hard to move the needle when there's not a lot of demand for the vehicles because there's no incentive for them to, like, companies to move that direction.
So I'm going to kind of use something you said to kind of ask the last question, which is, there's been a lot of attention recently on kind of like ESG and sustainability. And, now because of Putin, we're all like, okay, we need to get off of those fossil fuels and, these authoritarian states, blah, 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 blah. Do you think that this is going to be a fundamental change? Or do you think it's just going to be kind of more rhetoric and then greenwashing? I guess I'm trying to figure out, has there come a kind of inflection point where all of these concerns are now like real and not just marketing, and therefore startups like you, Elizabeth, or you, Donovan, are going to start to see like more investment in what can be capital intensive industries? Or do you think it's just going to be a lot of blah, 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 and people will just continue using the same old, same old? I'll start with Elizabeth.
I would say from a pure kind of economical perspective, I would say, if that was the decision for kind of this shift towards renewables, then, now is absolutely the time, right? So from a hardware perspective, solar is far more sort of cost competitive than gas. Just the fossil fuels, definitely compared to nuclear power. And just over the last 10 years alone, sort of solar has probably gone down by nearly 89%. Just kind of, so the sort of economic argument is super strong. I would say on the kind of grid scale, there's still some challenges around the fact that, obviously we've seen, in the UK context anyway, we've seen the policies that have been put out by the government over the last couple of years around last couple of weeks even, about increasing solar capacity 5x. It's great, sounds brilliant, but realistically, whether the grid, being old and aging as it is, can actually absorb that is the other challenge. And then obviously there's kind of issues around battery storage and how we will be able to deal with that, because it's not, solar is fundamentally not dispatchable power. So, but kind of people tend to think of like sort of solar and wind mostly, and there's very little attention paid towards things like biomass, so agricultural waste in particular, in that context. And so we actually think that microgrids that have biomass, so in particular agricultural waste as the sort of source of baseload power, can and in particular, get this, the model that we're testing out right now for a farm in Wiltshire is one where we actually think that farms could actually become the source of energy for the communities around them, because they've got a lot of agri waste already. And so it's a brilliant alternative to relying on the grid, which is 40% needing gas. And so having a microgrid, but the sort of the barriers that I would say are for microgrids historically has, or until now, I would say even, has been the fact that obviously these are smaller size systems, smaller size pieces of infrastructure. And so the investment, they don't kind of quite make the minimum ticket sizes of the typical kind of large infrastructure funds. And so I think the point where we will really see change in terms of investment will be once you're able to bundle up these into kind of groups of these assets, and then that would kind of allow it to go over that threshold to make it possible for investments to be made into these microgrids. But they can really make a tremendous difference in terms of where people's energy comes from and the ultimate affordability of energy, because it's not just a kind of problem in kind of other countries. I mean, here I have to kind of, there's a massive kind of cost of living crisis going on in the UK. And a big part of that is the cost of energy. And in parallel, farms are also facing their own kind of existential crisis in this country, with obviously after Brexit and the loss of direct payments as a result of that. So a model that actually puts farms at the heart of the energy transition would create for them new revenue streams, but also bring down the cost of energy for the communities that live around them. And we really want to be kind of a key element in making this possible. And we think kind of a key part of that is kind of the software tools that are critical to being able to handle the sort of analytics and life cycle management of these pieces of infrastructure at scale, which will ultimately bring down the ongoing cost of monitoring these investments from the perspective of a financial services provider, or from the perspective of, let's say, a developer that has lots of these assets in lots of locations. But yeah, so that's my take on the scenario.
Awesome. Okay, Donovan, how are you seeing the landscape? Are you expecting to get funding more easily because you are in the right space at the right time, or do you think it's all just kind of a lot of greenwashing?
No, I actually think there's opportunity, right? I think we're at like the same place the automotive industry started like 100 years ago, right? There's a lot of like attention being paid to it, right? Like, and we don't know, we like our horses. I don't know what a Model T is going to do for me, right? And then you actually expand upon it, and like the market is like full-fledged now, full of cars, right? And so I think it pays to pay attention to it. I think innovation is required, right? Like you can't kind of think of automotive industry the same way we have over the last 100 years, right? There's been a natural evolution, and now this is the next generation of evolution. And so I do think there's opportunity. I do think that I've gotten a lot of attention around what I'm doing, what I'm trying to achieve. And I do think that, when you think about how we address the problems, to Elizabeth's points, you have to be really, really creative, and assuming how things are done today and you can just like plug into them has to be reinvented. And that means that how we think about utilization profiles, how we think about like infrastructure needs, how we think about what cars look like today and what they feel like and how we utilize them and so forth. You kind of have to really, really be creative and say, hey, this could change for the better, but you have to be accepted to that change. And, when you're on board with that, right, like early on, you went out, as obvious as most people tell you, but like change is hard and slow, and sometimes really, really, there's a lot of resistance to it, but it's necessary. And I think we're on the birth of something massive that's happening in the transportation industry in general.
All right, Steve, do you buy the argument that this is kind of like a kind of fundamental change, or is it more marketing driven, or how do you see this change? How disruptive is it really?
Yeah, I don't I don't think this is just marketing. I think, there's been a realization that we have to do things differently. Reality is, of course, so that we're moving from kind of one set of natural resources to another, and how we manage that transition is going to be very important, because otherwise we'll just generate, it's either intended or unintended consequences as we make the shift. And we've all grown up with liquid fuels, with petroleum based fuels as powering pretty much everything that we do. And it's going to take some time for that shift. So when people say, well, it's not happening fast enough, that's probably true, but you have to also understand the size of the shift that we're talking about here. So I genuinely don't believe this is just greenwashing from an industry point of view. But when we complain a little bit about how complicated this is, it's because it is complicated. And we have hundreds of billions of dollars of assets sitting there, which we've been told we have to get rid of in the next 5 to 10 years if we follow the mandates that are coming to move out of internal combustion engines into EVs. And that takes us some time to figure out. So I think you'll always get the marketing spin from people who are telling you this is the best thing ever, and you should move and blah blah blah. But behind all of that, there's a lot of real work going on to figure out how to resolve these problems and make sure that we don't just generate another environmental crisis in an effort to solve the one that we think we've got at the moment. So this is a complex problem that we're trying to solve here, and it needs smart startups, it needs mature businesses like mine, and it needs governments all to work together, which is a little bit of a cliche, but it's true, to get us through this. Otherwise we'll just lurch into the next crisis if we're not careful.
All right, and Kyan, I'll give you the final word as the entrepreneur and now investor. You've been on both sides, and you also wanted to go into government at some point. So what are you bullish on? How do you see this all playing out, and where are you investing your money?
Yeah, I mean, I think ultimately, just because we kind of called out corporate government versus startup, I sort of see like the responsibility of startup is to like be the spear that allows for everyone else to then see how to basically understand the market, play within the market, and create stability within the market, right? I mean, a corporate plays a great job of providing a systemized process by which scale can happen, right? Startups are not based on system and process. They're based on disproving and quickly leveraging one small thing, right, to prove that there is a need, there is an interest. And then they try and corporatize themselves after that to get systems and run according to margin, process, etc. So I see that as, those are fundamentally just different sides of a spectrum, not necessarily, in, let's say, competition to one another. And I think ultimately, government obviously gets the benefit of seeing what's being pushed by the spear and then being further pushed by the, let's say, shaft from the corporate in a way where they know how to then create the whole that is the legislation and regulation to allow for more of that innovation to come through. And so I definitely see it as a system effect where we often see them in, either in competition or one being a barrier or blocker to the other. And I think the next wave, not only in, sustainable movement, is allowing for us to see that instead as a sort of complete holistic system. And I think that goes back to how do we really change this mobility and the overall frame of, what is sustainable movement, is to look at it as a system. I mean, I think to Steve's point, like if we just got a whole bunch of electric cars, but they're poorly built and the batteries are being thrown away left, right, and center and have no range, then it actually hasn't been a net positive. So it has to be seen not just as, wow, we can make electric. It has to be seen as, we have to do electric sustainably, which requires grid problems, which requires battery problems, which requires, allowing us to regenerate electricity from breaks, like all these different aspects that really create the system that then propels a change that's more than just greenwashing.
All right. So I think this has been an awesome panel. Like I've learned a lot. And I think the bottom line is, if I got it right, is that we all need to work together. There's a lot of work to be done. And hopefully that means also a lot of money to be made. And hopefully we can do it in a way that's inclusive so that people from all different sorts of walks of life, including people like Elizabeth, who kind of grew up with the candle, but now is kind of creating a solution to the problem that she grew up with. I think that it'll be an awesome place if we can have a world in which that's possible. So thanks to all of you for joining the panel, and thanks to all of you for listening. Thanks, guys.
Thanks all.
Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.
Thanks. Bye.